"Ma'am, the guest and spouse line is on the other side of the lobby," the captain said. He didn't look up from his roster, his voice saturated with a weary authority that was more practiced than earned. His finger, tracing the list of names, was the only thing that moved. "This check-in is for active duty personnel." Melissa Ward remained perfectly still. Her hands, clasped loosely in front of her, were steady. Her gaze was fixed on the young officer, taking in the crisp lines of his dress blue uniform, the shine on his shoes, the single silver bar on each collar. He was a picture of Marine Corps precision, and yet he hadn't once made eye contact with the person he was dismissing. Around them, the hotel lobby buzzed with the controlled energy of a Marine Corps birthday ball. Polished marble floors reflected the grand chandeliers and the scarlet and gold of the official colors draped from the balconies. A string quartet played softly in the corner, its classical melodies a genteel counterpoint to the sharp, percussive laughter of Marines greeting one another. Her royal blue top was a slash of civilian color in a sea of formal uniforms, and she knew it made her an anomaly. "I believe I'm in the right place, Captain," she said. Her voice was even, carrying a quiet resonance that made the two lance corporals flanking the captain glance up. This time the captain lifted his head. His eyes, clear and confident, swept over her. He took in the long blonde hair, the tasteful jewelry, the elegant blue fabric. His gaze registered everything but respect. A small, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips. It was the look of a man who believed he had the situation completely figured out. "With all due respect, ma'am," he began, the phrase a well-worn shield for disrespect. "The active duty line is for, well, active duty. If your husband is checking in, you can just wait for him here. I'm sure he'll be along shortly." He turned to one of the lance corporals. "Martinez, see if you can't find a chair for Mrs." He trailed off, looking back at her expectantly. "My name is Melissa Ward," she supplied, her tone unchanged. She held out her identification. "And I'm not waiting for my husband." The captain, whose name tape read Davis, took the card with a sigh of put-upon patience. He expected a dependent ID, a flimsy piece of plastic that would validate his assumption and end this tedious interaction. What he saw instead made him pause. The card was a standard retired military ID, but the information on it caused a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He turned it over, then back again, his thumb rubbing the surface as if trying to wipe away a misprint. "This is a retired ID," he stated, the words slow and deliberate, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "This ball is for our battalion. We don't have a lot of retirees on the guest list, unless they're specifically invited as guests of honor. Are you our guest of honor?" He asked the question with a saccharine smile, the joke obvious to everyone at the table. The other lance corporal stifled a snort. "You could say that," Melissa said, her patience a deep, seemingly inexhaustible well. Captain Davis was now enjoying himself. He was the gatekeeper, the man in charge, and he had an audience of junior Marines. He was performing a lesson in diligence. "Okay, ma'am, let's work this out." He placed her ID on the table and leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the lobby. "Sometimes these things can be confusing. Is it possible you're at the wrong event? The VFW has their dinner next weekend. Easy mistake to make." A few Marines in line behind Melissa began to shift their weight, their own discomfort growing. They could sense the friction, the slow, grinding humiliation being dispensed by the young captain. They were trained to respect the chain of command, to obey orders, but they were also trained to recognize when one of their own was making a colossal mistake. Yet they stayed quiet, their silence a form of passive consent. "I can assure you, Captain," Melissa replied, her voice losing none of its calm, "I am at the correct event." "Right. Well, I don't see your name on the active duty roster," he said, tapping the paper in front of him for emphasis. "And you're not on the distinguished visitor list I was provided." He leaned back, crossing his arms. It was a posture of finality. "So you see my problem. I have procedures to follow. Security is paramount." He was no longer just an officer at a check-in table. He was a fortress, defending the sanctity of the ball from a civilian interloper with a questionable ID. "Perhaps your list is incomplete," Melissa suggested gently. "Could you check again?" "Ward, Melissa." "I have checked, ma'am," he said, his tone hardening. "The game was over. I've checked twice. Your name is not here. Now I have a very long line of Marines to check in, Marines who have a right to be here. So if you don't mind," he gestured again toward the other side of the lobby, a clear and final dismissal. The second lance corporal, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, fidgeted with a stack of programs. He refused to meet Melissa's eyes, his focus entirely on the sharp creases of the paper. He knew this was wrong. He could feel it in the air, a static charge of impending disaster. The captain was too confident, too dismissive. The woman was too calm, too composed. Her stillness was more commanding than the captain's bluster. "Captain Davis," Melissa said, her voice still quiet but now edged with a fine, hard layer of steel. "I'm going to ask you one more time to check your master guest roster, not your abbreviated check-in sheet." The full list provided by the base command. The directness of the command, the use of his name, and the specific instruction seemed to momentarily stun him. It was a subtle shift in the power dynamic, and he felt it. His response was to reassert his dominance more forcefully. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are," he snapped, his face flushing slightly. "But I am the officer in charge of this checkpoint. I am telling you, you are not on the list. Now, for the last time, please step aside." He picked up her ID card, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a contaminated object. His eyes narrowed on a small pin affixed to the lapel of her blue top, just above her heart. It was a simple, unassuming decoration, a small gold frame with a blue center, adorned with a tiny bronze oak leaf cluster. To him it was just another piece of civilian jewelry, probably meaningless. "What is this even supposed to be?" he asked, pointing at the pin. "Some kind of commemorative pin from a gift shop." The pin was a Joint Meritorious Unit Award. The oak leaf cluster signified a second award. As his condescending question hung in the air, the polished lobby around Melissa seemed to dissolve. The scent of perfume and floor wax was replaced by the smell of ozone, diesel, and hot metallic dust. The gentle music of the string quartet faded, replaced by the high-pitched whine of generators and the frantic, overlapping chatter of encrypted radios inside a tactical operations center. She wasn't in a hotel. She was back in Al-Anbar province, a lieutenant colonel standing over a sand table, the flickering light of a laptop screen illuminating the exhausted faces of her staff. They had been working for 36 straight hours, redirecting logistics for a major offensive after an enemy attack had wiped out their primary supply route. Ammunition, water, blood, everything the battalions at the tip of the spear needed was running critically low. The situation was on the verge of collapse. It was her plan, a daring, unconventional rerouting of convoys through a sector believed to be impassable, that had broken the deadlock. It was a massive gamble that had paid off, saving the offensive and an untold number of lives. This small, insignificant pin he was mocking was awarded to her unit, to her for that exact moment of clarity under fire. It was a symbol of pressure, of responsibility, of a burden he couldn't possibly comprehend. Her mind snapped back to the present. The captain's smug face was still staring at her, waiting for an answer. She didn't give him one. She simply held his gaze, letting the silence stretch. Across the lobby, leaning against a marble pillar and observing the flow of guests, was Sergeant Major retired Thomas Collier. He was working a side job, hired by the hotel for his expertise in event security. For the past 10 minutes, he'd been watching the unfolding drama at the check-in table with a growing sense of dread. He hadn't been able to hear the entire conversation, but he could read the body language. He saw a young, arrogant captain puffing out his chest, and a civilian woman standing her ground with the kind of unshakable poise that you didn't learn in a corporate boardroom. Then a fragment of their conversation drifted across the floor. "My name is Melissa Ward." The name hit Collier like a physical blow. Ward. He squinted, his mind racing, flipping through the Rolodex of names and faces accumulated over a 30-year career. He didn't recognize her face, not immediately. Women with blonde hair looked different in their late 50s than they did as majors in their 30s, their hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun under a cover. But the name, Ward, they used to call her the Oracle at Logistics Command. She was a legend, one of those officers whose reputation preceded them by a decade. An officer who could move mountains of supplies with a phone call and a spreadsheet. An officer who had on more than one occasion dressed down full colonels for operational sloppiness. An officer who had retired a few years ago as a brigadier general. A cold sweat broke out on Collier's neck. He watched as Captain Davis gestured dismissively, his posture screaming disrespect. This was a car crash in slow motion. Collier knew he couldn't just walk over there. A retired sergeant major correcting a captain in public in front of his troops was a breach of protocol that could have its own negative repercussions. The chain of command was a sacred thing, even when one link was being a complete fool. But he also couldn't do nothing. This wasn't just an insult to a veteran, it was an insult to a general officer. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, his fingers flying across the screen. He had the cell number for the battalion executive officer, a major he knew from a previous tour. He typed a quick, urgent message. "Sir, you need to get to the main entrance checkpoint. Now, Captain Davis is violating rule number 1. The major texted back almost instantly. "What rule?" Collier typed his reply, his thumbs heavy. "Never assume the unassuming woman in civilian clothes isn't the guest of honor." And a general. He hit send. The message was delivered. The cavalry had been summoned. Now all he could do was watch and pray the response was fast enough. He looked back at the table. Captain Davis was taking a step too far, his hand reaching for his phone as if to call security. Collier's heart sank. He wasn't fast enough. Inside the cacophonous ballroom, the battalion's executive officer, Major Graham, read the sergeant major's text and felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. He immediately pushed his way through the crowd, making a beeline for the command table where the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts, was speaking with the base chief of staff. "Sir, we have a problem," Graham said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait for a response, simply handed the phone to his CO. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts read the text, his expression shifting from convivial to alarmed. "General Ward? Our keynote speaker is General Ward?" He looked at the chief of staff, a full colonel, whose face had gone pale. The colonel grabbed an iPad from his aide and furiously swiped through the event manifest. He bypassed the simple guest list and went to the detailed distinguished visitor file. He tapped her name, and the screen filled with her biography. Brigadier General Melissa Ward, retired. The file was a testament to a career spent in the crucible. Command billets at every level. A tour at the Pentagon. Deputy Commander of Marine Corps Logistics Command. A string of awards that included the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and that small innocuous Joint Meritorious Unit Award with an oak leaf cluster. A photo of her, years younger, stood next to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, accepting an award. "Oh God," the colonel breathed. He looked at Roberts. "Your Captain Davis is at the front door dressing down the guest of honor." He didn't have to say another word. The small group of senior officers began moving as one. Their expressions grim, their pace a controlled fury that cut a swath through the oblivious celebrating crowd. Back in the lobby, Captain Davis had reached the end of his non-existent rope. His authority had been questioned, his process had been delayed, and his audience of junior Marines was now looking at him with expressions that mixed fear and pity. He had to end this. "Ma'am, I have given you every possible chance to cooperate," he said, his voice loud and formal, for the benefit of anyone watching. "You have no invitation, your name is not on my list, and you have refused to step aside. I am now forced to conclude that this identification is fraudulent." He let that last venomous word hang in the air. "Falsifying a military ID is a federal offense. Lance Corporal Martinez, please call base security. Have them escort this woman from the premises." The young Marine froze, his eyes wide with panic. He looked from the captain to the woman, and back again. His hand hovered over his radio, but he didn't move. He was a deer in the headlights, caught between a direct order from his superior and the screaming instinct that he was about to participate in a career-ending catastrophe. It was in that moment of frozen indecision that the double doors to the ballroom swung open with a resounding bang. The arrival was not a cacophony of sirens and flashing lights, but it was just as dramatic. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts, the battalion commander, burst into the lobby, followed closely by the base chief of staff and Major Graham. They moved with a singular, ferocious purpose that immediately silenced the ambient chatter. The string quartet faltered, the last note of a waltz dying in the air. Every head in the lobby turned. The sheer condensed weight of command authority washed over the room, a palpable force that made everyone stand a little straighter. The senior officers didn't slow down until they were at the check-in table. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts completely ignored his captain. His eyes were locked on Melissa Ward. He came to a dead stop 3 feet in front of her and executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his life. His hand didn't just meet his brow, it cracked into place with a sound that echoed in the cavernous, silent room. "General Ward," he said, his voice ringing with a deference that bordered on reverence. "On behalf of the entire command, please accept my deepest, most sincere apologies for this inexcusable delay. It is an absolute honor to have you with us this evening." The Chief of Staff and Major Graham followed suit, their own salutes snapping into place. 3 senior officers, standing at rigid attention, saluting a woman in a royal blue top. Captain Davis stared, his mouth slightly agape. The world had just tilted on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. His brain struggled to process the scene, to reconcile the word general with the woman he had just threatened to have arrested. The 2 lance corporals looked as though they had just witnessed a ghost. The lieutenant colonel held his salute for a long, deliberate moment before dropping it. He then turned his head slowly, his eyes like chips of ice fixing on Captain Davis. "Captain," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "were you aware that you were speaking to Brigadier General Melissa Ward?" The architect of the entire logistics strategy for Operation Desert Trident? The woman who literally wrote the book on expeditionary sustainment that you were supposed to have studied at the basic school? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to General Ward, his voice once again warm and respectful, but loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. Ma'am, I was just reviewing your biography to prepare for your introduction. I hope you don't mind if I share how thrilled we are to have a leader of your caliber, a recipient of the Defense Superior Service Medal, and the former deputy commander for the entire Marine Corps Logistics Command, as our guest of honor tonight. A wave of whispers swept through the assembled crowd. Phones were discreetly raised. The young Marines who had been laughing and joking moments before were now standing in stunned, reverent silence. They were in the presence of a living legend, and they had just watched a clueless captain treat her like a trespasser. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts turned his full attention to the trembling Captain Davis. The silence was absolute. "Captain," the commander began, his voice a low, controlled growl that was more terrifying than any shout. "My office, Monday morning, 0600. You will be in your Service A uniform, and you will have a 1-page handwritten letter of apology to General Ward. You will also have a 5-page handwritten essay on the topic of customs and courtesies, with a specific focus on dealing with retired personnel and distinguished visitors. But most of all, you are going to explain to me how you could stand there wearing the uniform of a United States Marine Corps officer and show such a profound and complete lack of judgment and respect. You do not look at a person and see what you assume. You look at them and see who they are. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Davis whispered, his voice cracking. Before the commander could continue, General Ward held up a hand. "Lieutenant Colonel, that's enough," she said, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension like a warm knife. She turned her gaze to Captain Davis, who flinched as if she had struck him. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, weary disappointment that was somehow worse. "Captain," she said, "the uniform changes, we get older, but the standards don't. Your responsibility here was to verify credentials, not to validate your own biases. Remember that. The core of leadership isn't giving orders, it's seeing people clearly. Be better." Her words were not an attack but a lesson, a final precise piece of instruction from a senior officer to a junior one. As she spoke of standards, a final fleeting image bloomed in her mind. She was a brand new second lieutenant, caked in mud from head to toe at Quantico. It was the final test of the combat endurance course. She was exhausted, her muscles screaming, every fiber of her being telling her to quit. A grizzled gunnery sergeant, his face a roadmap of old wars, stood over her, his expression unreadable. "The standard is the standard, Lieutenant," he had growled. "Meet it." She had dug deep, pushed past the pain and finished the course. As she stumbled across the line, the gunny had caught her eye and given her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first time she had truly felt like a Marine. The standard was the standard. In the weeks following the birthday ball, the ripple effects of Captain Davis's mistake spread throughout the base. A new mandatory training module on protocol and professional interaction was implemented for all personnel assigned to event duties. The check-in procedures were overhauled, with a renewed emphasis on verifying all guests against the master roster with courtesy and discretion. Captain Davis was formally reprimanded and quietly reassigned to a dreary staff position in the base's records department, a paper-pushing job that was a clear and humiliating dead end for an ambitious officer. About a month later, Davis was in the base library, researching a tedious report on historical filing discrepancies. He looked up from a dusty manual and saw General Ward sitting at a table near the window, reading a novel, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. She was wearing simple civilian clothes and looked like any other retiree enjoying a quiet afternoon. His heart hammered in his chest. He could have just walked away, hidden in the stacks. But her words to him in the lobby, "Be better," echoed in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked over to her table. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral. "General Ward," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He stood at a respectful position of attention. "Ma'am, I just wanted to apologize again, in person. What I did was inexcusable. There's no excuse for my behavior. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and beneath the conduct of a Marine officer. I am truly and deeply sorry." Melissa Ward studied him for a long moment. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the deep shame that had settled into his features. She closed her book and gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit down, Captain." He hesitated, then sat, perching on the edge of the seat. "You made a mistake, a big one," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You let assumption override procedure. It's a dangerous habit for a leader. You will pay a professional price for it. The question is, what will you learn from it? I'll learn to follow the list, ma'am, he said quickly. She shook her head gently. No, that's too simple. You'll learn to look at every single person you meet, from a private to a general, from a janitor to a senator, and afford them the baseline of dignity and respect they deserve as a human being. Your job is to lead Marines. You can't do that if you're blinded by your own prejudices. Don't waste this lesson, Captain. It's a painful one, but it could be the one that saves your career, or at least makes you a better man. She picked up her book, a quiet signal that the conversation was over. Captain Davis stood, offered a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," and walked away, feeling the weight of his mistake, but also, for the first time, a small, fragile seed of hope. The stories of women like General Ward are a testament to the strength and resilience of all our service members. They met the standard, and then set a new one. To honor their legacy and hear more stories of valor, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.